The trials of a tenderfoot cowboy on the plains in the early 70s were only exceeded by the trials of such of them as survived their apprenticeship with enough hardihood left to become tenderfoot ranchmen. One not only caught it going and coming, but often got it hardest when neither going nor coming. And the harder one got it, the greater the kindness to him. If his mettle rang true under test, the sooner was he accepted into the grim and more or less grizzled order of old-timers. If it rang false, the quicker was he brought to a realization that for him, the plains offered little of opportunity, save a chance to split the scenery along the shortest trail, east. Neither breeding, brains, nor money counted among the nervy nomads of the range. It was make good or make tracks. And for the best man, it was far from easy to make good. The sudden transition from the ease and luxuries of civilization to the hard riding, hard fare, and hard bed of a cowboy was trying, to say the least. At high noon of a beautiful June day, the Overland Express pulled me into Cheyenne, Wyoming, and out of it I stepped into an atmosphere with a nip in it that set one's blood tingling like a glass of champagne. Out of it I stepped, a youngster not yet of age, bent to be a cowboy. Before leaving the train, I had prudently strapped to my waist a new, how distressingly new, .45 Colt's six-shooter that looked and felt a yard long. The one possession larger than this pistol that left the train with me was my desire to learn to use it. For I then suspected, and a few days later proved, that it was idle for me to hope to hit with it anything in the landscape smaller than the heavens above or the earth beneath me. In fact, for several months, the safest thing in my neighborhood was whatever I tried to shoot at with that pistol, safer even than I myself who held it, for until I learned its tricks, the recoil at each discharge gave me a smash in the forehead from hammer or barrel that made me wish I had been the target instead of the marksman. At the station I was met by dear old N.R. Davis, the hardest of taskmasters on a tenderfoot quitter, and the best of mentors and friends to a stayer. While I brought a letter of commendation from his partner and my best friend, Clarence King, he could not help showing that I lacked his approval, nor was he to be blamed. 2 years before a tussle of several weeks with a brain fever, immediately succeeding 6 months of exceptionally hard work while in charge of the New York Tribune's verbatim report of the Henry Ward Beecher trial, had left me very much of a physical wreck, and I dare say I looked to him better fit to hold down a hospital cot than to fork a cayuse. Then there was my regalia. For my own condition, doubtless he had a latent sympathy, but my rig incited his open resentment. The rig I had taken so much time in selecting and felt so proud of, he quickly consigned to the scrap heap. Lace boots, little knee leggings, short hunting spurs, little round soft hat, everything. Indeed, but my pistol. And even the pistol had to be stripped of its flap holster and rehabited in the then new décolleté olive scabbard. The early afternoon was spent in assembling a proper outfit: a bridle, 40-pound saddle, 40-foot rawhide lariat, California spurs with 2-inch rowels, and leather straps that, when I got them on, felt like they weighed a ton and made me look like I weighed 10 pounds, were bought at Frank Mania's, a tarpaulin, a buffalo robe, and 2 blankets for my camp bed, boots, and a big hat, John Harrington furnished, and then fortified by 2 toddies at Luke Morane's, which N.R. had evidently suggested from motives of sheer humanity. We climbed into his buckboard, forded Crow Creek, and bowled away south for his Owl Creek ranch, behind a span of half-broke half-breeds that spent as little time on the ground and as much up in the air as their harness handicap permitted. At that time, N.R. had the finest horse ranch and best bred horses in all Wyoming. a herd that headed by the famous old thoroughbred stallion, Huerfano, loved the game of conquering and training them, and never drove a gentle pair if he could help it. Humored his mad pets when he could, rough-handled them when he must to maintain mastery, and never was he happier than when, straining on the reins, before him plunged a savage pair, eyes bloodshot, leathered flanks heaving, tails switching, manes tossing, muscles surging, cruel heels flying towards his face in a nip-and-tuck struggle, where it was his neck and their freedom or their bondage and his mastery. There was little talk on the drive. The pair kept him too busy, and concern about what part of my anatomy might first hit the ground kept me thinking. Halfway or more, out he spoke. "Wonder if Kingy had it in for you and me, letting you come out here. I guess for both of us, thought we'd both be sure to get it. But mind, I'm not going to favor you. You've got to take your medicine with Con Hemphrey's outfit, and he's about as tough as rawhide as ever led a circle. But he always gets there, and that's the only reason I keep him. It's lay close to old Con's flank, kid, and keep your end up, or turn in your string of horses. On the roundup, no soldiering goes. Sick or well, it's hit yourself in the flank with your hat and keep up with a bunch, or be set afoot to pack your saddle. There's no room in the chuck wagon for a quitter's blankets, and no time to close herd sick ones. So, for heaven's sake, don't start out unless you have the guts to stand it." While far short of encouraging, it was nevertheless plain that Enar's every word was conceived in kindness. So I simply answered that, while I would, of course, prove unhandy at the new work, he could rely on the moment I found I could not keep out of the way of the experienced punchers. I would myself want to turn in my horse and quit the outfit. Then he resumed. "I'm totally branding this summer, making a tally or inventory of all our cattle and horses for an accounting and settlement with my partners. The corrals are full of cattle. It will take all day tomorrow to run through the chutes and hairbrand. The next morning, Con starts his outfit down Willow to round up the Pawnee Butte country. I'll pass you up to Con tonight, and what he makes of the new hand will depend on what he finds in it. We'll dump your blankets and tricks at the chuck wagon, and you can make down among the boys. Earlier you start, the sooner you learn. And that, I guess, is what you're here for. Don't mind the boys. They'll rough you a lot, but most of it will be good-humored. If any get ugly, you'll have to call them down, that's all." A little after dark, we reached the ranch, a big, comfortable frame house with wide piazzas, through whose windows I caught glimpses of snowy linen and gleaming silver and cut glass in a cheerful dining room that made a picture of comfort and luxury, and told a story of generous feeding that for the next 30 days was seldom long out of mind. At the back of the handsome ranch house stood a little log cabin, now the winter home of N.D., the Davis brand, punchers that told of humble beginnings 5 years before. A few hundred feet south of the house stood the stables, and near these a bunch of great corrals, built of grout, solid walls of mortar and gravel. This was all, no pasture, no fences, just the broad prairies rolling in all directions to the horizon. Past ranch and corrals tinkled Owl Creek, a little brook one could step across. That struck me as the most pathetic bit of water I then had ever seen. Born of a tiny spring that feebly pushed its way into the sunlight from beneath a low bluff, a scant half-mile went off the ranch, a spring bubbling with the mirth and singing with the joy of release from its subterranean prison, happy in the generous bounty it had to bestow upon this arid land, wondering, like any other young thing, what lay beyond its horizons, and eager to hurry on and see. The last precious drops of Owl Creek's sweet waters were soon greedily drunk by the thirsting plains, gone back into Mother Earth's deep bosom, whence they had so recently come, and its career ended, a scant half-mile east of the ranch. There was so much Owl Spring wanted to do, and so little it did. It slacked the thirst of a few men and beasts, one slender cottonwood, frail as the mother that fed it. But affectionately, over the spring, 2 narrow ribbons of juicy green grasses owed life to the spring and followed it faithfully to its end. That was all. Forever shut within its narrow horizon, though offspring was, fated never to know fellow waters, and merrily to wander with them out into the world. Nevertheless, it was spared all contamination, and was privileged to sink to its last rest as clean and pure as when its first rippling smile received the sun's first kiss. A merry fire blazed at the tail end of the chuck wagon. About it were sitting 16 punchers, feeding from tin plates and cups, gorging on beans, beef, and baking powder biscuits, washed down with coffee strong enough to float an egg, men with the ferocious hunger of the wolf and the case-hardened stomach of the ostrich. They were of all ages, from 16 to 60, but most of them under 30, all grimy with the dust, and several reeking with the blood of the day's work in the corrals. It was plain I was downright welcome to the bunch, but in a way that boded anything but good for me, while no life of greater privation and hardship than the cowboys ever existed, unless that in the forecastle of a windjammer no merrier, jollier lot ever lived, always joshing each other, turning a jest on every condition in life, from the cradle to the grave, but one, home and mammy, a subject on which tones always lowered, eyes softened, and sometimes grew misty. A glance about the circle explained the warmth of my welcome. I was the only tenderfoot in camp, thus the odds were 16 to 1. I was in for trouble, and it was not long coming. I nearly stalled at the rude fare and ate little. "Kid," drawled Tobacco Jake, "if you reckons to tote that full-grown gun all day tomorrow, you better ile your jints with sow-belly and fill up on all the holler places inside you with beans and biscuit. You sure look like you hadn't no man's grub in a month." I replied I had been something of an invalid, and that it was true my physical condition was hardly up to par. "Look here, kid," replied Jake, "if you can't talk our language, you just make signs. What in hell you trying to say anyway?" Before I could reply, Jack Talbot cut in. "He sure do look like a doggy, a motherless calf. 'Tain't got used to eating grass. Gee, but won't the beans rattle in his craw when he climbs his first bronc. About 2 jumps and a twist, and I allow he'll just naturally fall to pieces, and we'll have to bunch the remains in a war sack and send 'em to his ma. Bet you my gun again, you silver-trimmed spade. Bet the first jump fetches him, and it's us to pick up the chips," cheerfully suggested Jake. "Wouldn't let him fork one of my top cutters, bareback for nothing," was the pleasantly impersonal comment of Lionel Lou. "He's so knotted up and thin, he'd give it worse saddle galls than airy old horse-eating Mexico tree ever crossed the Rio Grande." Another happy thought struck Jake, and out it came. "Say, fellers, I allow his folks, we'd sort of like to plant him in the family stiff a lot, but they sure won't be willin' to be set back much paying freight on his busted carcass. Let's see if we-uns can't help him out. When he do come apart, let's see if we can't load him in his own gun. Looks like he'd just about chamber in her, then just nonchalantly shoot him back where he come from, and save him the express price." These were only a few of the more refined and agreeable sallies that greeted me my first evening in cow camp. In fact, I was beginning to get pretty hot in the collar, when at length a friendly voice spoke, that of Tex, a man I soon learned to trust, and later to love, who through many years stood as steadfastly my friend as on this night of the little tenderfoot's first trials. "Fellers," he quietly observed, "just shut your yap, pronto. Let the kid alone. It's me saying it. Of course, he ain't going to keep up with no leaders on the circle, but I've got a fool idea he won't be so fur behind. We'll lose him none." I was the subject of no more open comments that night, but until the last pair were asleep, there were whispers and snickers that left no doubt They were still having their fun at my expense. By dawn the next morning, we were routed out by the cook, and by good sunup had finished breakfast, and were in the corrals for the day's work at tally branding. The great pens were filled with wild range cattle, the gather of the last roundup, old and young. The golden duns, pale yellows, light reds, and piebald black and whites, all with great wide-spreading horns, characteristic of the old Spanish stock of southern Texas, predominated, with here and there the short horns, dark red and greater bulk, of a Durham cross, the bald face of a Hereford, or the hornless head and solid black color of a Pollard Angus. And wild indeed they were, looked and acted like it, eyes blazing, horns shaking threateningly, surging back and forth across the corral, sometimes in solid mass, an irresistible tide stopped only by the heavy walls of the pen, sometimes moving in winding counter-currents, like the waters of an eddy, bulls bellowing, cows lowing, steers snorting, calves blatting, a mass of color shifting and brilliant as any ever seen in a kaleidoscope. And into this sea of tossing horns, it was ours to jump and work all day, on foot. And jump it was all day, and keep your eyes about. A fire was quickly lighted, and the branding irons laid in it, heating for their cruel task. Along one side of the corral ran a narrow chute long enough to hold 20 animals, standing heads to tails, the outer end opening in the prairie, the inner in a closed pen 30 feet in diameter. This closed pen was filled with cattle from the main corral, driven in by the dismounted punchers, yelling and swinging clubs, or anything we could lay our hands on. Then from this pen and chute was filled, the rear end barred, and in 5 minutes 2 or 3 men handling the irons had lightly hair-branded the imprisoned beasts. The outer gate was opened, and they were released, bounding out to freedom, bawling from the pain of the iron. And, bar an hour for dinner at midday, so this round was repeated till nearly dark, when the corrals were emptied. While no work could be harder, and few tasks involved less of ever-present momentary peril to limb or life, while the foreman was a mean, ill-natured brute, often needlessly exacting, cursing at a moment's pause in the work, and cordially hated by all, while begrimed and often blinded by dust and smoke and sweat, never have I seen schoolboys merrier at their play, fuller of jests, pranks, and rough horseplay, than were those cow-punchers at their work. In mid-afternoon, my friend, Tobacco Jake, near met his finish. While working over the chute, a great bull made a savage dig at him. The dull, rounded point of one horn landed on Jake's jaw, fracturing it, and laying him out so stiff, we thought for some time he was surely done for. The trend of sympathy was expressed by Lano Lou. Powerful hard luck on Jake, busted his talk box. Reckon he'd rather stay dead and come to if he knowed it. And if he do stay dead, he sure won't make no very sociable ghost unless he meets up with spirits to knows Injun sign talk. All day long I had been getting a continuous joshing, mock sympathy for my weakness and feigned anxiety for my safety. If an angry beast charged my way, one or more of the boys would push me aside and take my place, while others strove to turn the charge. When it came in my way to pick up anything from the ground, no matter how insignificantly small and light, one or more pair of hands were instantly reached out to help me lift it. And when my face was observed streaming with sweat, one or another would solicitously try to wipe it with the slack of a loose bandana neckerchief. By evening, my amour propre was downright raw, and I was resolved to make the first play that offered to lift myself in my mate's esteem. Just at the close of the day's work, the chance came. As through the late afternoon, the numbers in the main corral rapidly dwindled until few were left, with more room to run, and evidently made nervous by watching the mass of the herd streaming through the chute to the liberty of the open range. Those remaining became more and more restive, and, as the boys put it, hostile. One in particular, a lean, active, white 2-year-old heifer, the foreman had seriously warned all of us to watch carefully. And when at length we sought to drive the last little lot of them into the clothes pen, all entered safely after 2 or 3 trials, except this white heifer, which charged back through our yelling, arm-swinging line of punchers that quickly broke to right and left at her approach, many not stopping short of the top of the fence, a proceeding that struck me as wholly undignified. It also seemed unnecessary, for each swung in his hands a stout club of some sort, heavy enough to stun or turn her, if rightly landed. My hand weapon was a straight blade, short-handled spade, and I quickly formed what seemed to me the sound piece of strategy, of waiting her charge, if she came at me, until the last second, and then leaping aside and dropping her with a blow between the horns. Run from her, I resolved, I would not. Repeatedly, we lined up and crowded her up to the gate, where she would stand an instant, angrily lashing her tail, and then whirl and charge, the boys scattering out of her course. Presently I got what I had thought I wanted. She charged me straight. Quickly swinging the spade over my shoulder for the blow, and shifting my feet slightly in a gather for the leap aside, I slipped on the now muddy ground and fell flat on my back, dropping the spade in the effort to recover myself. And no more was I down than the heifer was upon me, head lowered and sharp horns pointed for the coup de mort of her race. But, surprised by my fall, she braced her forefeet, went a little distance from me, and literally slid through the mud up to me, till her 2 hooves gave me a pretty good dig in the ribs, then backed away 2 or 3 feet, then nuzzled my body and face in inquiry, and lightly prodded me with her horns for any sign of life. Lying motionless, through half-closed lids, I plainly saw the fury in her eyes soften with wonder and curiosity. However, I could have gone dead so quickly, and then she lightly leaped across my body and was gone. And nobody called me slow in reaching and mounting to the security of the nearest fence top. It all happened so quickly, I actually hadn't time to get scared, or even nervous until after it was all over, and such as I then felt, the boys quickly knocked out of me with their jests. "Hoot, lad," called Red Cameron, the cook. "But old Horny nigh got you the wiles, hot off the end of his kind of weapons. Gin ye had a muckle sense as luck, you'd get your immortality in this world by living forever." Then Llanoloo, "Mama, but who'd have thought the kid was locoed enough to tackle a fighting heifer afoot? His thinker must sure be as puny as his carcass. Ain't nothing but him between the 2 plats fool enough to tackle that away, a lightweight 2-year-old held bent for trouble, like Miss Blanco there. If we don't have to neck him to cook to keep him from killing his fool self, for we hits the Pawnee." And again good old Tex to my aid. "You just tighten the latigo on that jaw of yourn. 'Pears to me like the kid's got a tolerable heavy jag of sand mixed with his loco, a hell of a sight better'n yourn, Lou. Better see if you can't get to trade him some of your tongue ile for some of his sand. If I don't think he's got right smart to spare, and still stack up with airy puncher in the pen," a kindly sentiment that won some adherents in the bunch, as shown by some awkward but friendly advances. That night beans and biscuit tasted good to me, and the lumpy mattress of buffalo grass felt better. The next morning I turned out rather stiff from my first day's work, and a bit sore from Miss Blanco's hooves and horns, but otherwise fit as a fiddle. Breakfast over in 20 minutes, camp kettles, war sacks, and beds were loaded into the chuck wagon, horses caught and saddled, and we were mounted and headed southeast for Willow Creek. N.R. had assigned me a string of 5 horses, all kind and gentle, and unusually good ones, I later realized to entrust to a tenderfoot. Average hands were never assigned less than 4 horses each for range roundup work, and top hands who had the heavy work of cutting the roundups, separating the cattle, wanted from those not wanted, rarely less than 7 or 8 horses. And there were never too many horses, seldom enough. Lacking corn and all other fodder but the native grasses, it was only by frequent change of mounts and long intervals of rest for each that they could be kept in fair flesh, strong of wind and limb and sound of back, in a saddle from dawn to dark, and then riding at 2 to 3 hours, turn at night, guard, around the herd in hand. 50 to 70 miles a day was no more than an average distance daily covered by the average cowboy on the roundup, and throughout a third to sometimes more than half the day, the pace was the pony's top speed, handling and turning wild cattle bent on escape. Thus, by the noon finish of a morning circle sides were leathered, flanks drawn, strength and wind gone, and fresh mounts necessary. While during the afternoon's work of cutting the herd, the pace was so killing for the top cutters, with a terrible shock of sudden sharp turns and short stops, that 1 or 2 changes were always desirable. This first day in the saddle on the open range was a tough one on the tenderfoot, the easiest saddle on the rider in the world once you're used to it. The cow saddle is far harder to get on comfortable terms with than the flat pigskin. It gives a beginner harder cramps and tenderer spots in more parts of the anatomy than any punishment conceivable short of an inquisition rack. Thus, by midday, every part of me ached cruelly, and by night I was so stiff and numb that, when dismounted, every step was agony, and by that time I had acquired an even greater mental than bodily agony. The plains through which we rode were simply alive with great rattlesnakes, some coiled comfortably beneath the shade of a greasewood or prickly pear, some stretched lazily in the sun, some crawling about, all alert for mischief, quick to coil, rattle and strike at whatever approached them, forked tongues thrusting maliciously, poison fangs gleaming like 2 miniature scimitars. All day long we were scarcely ever 10 minutes out of sight of them. How any living thing contrived to exist within reach of those thousands of ever-ready and venomed fangs was past understanding. To ride among them was bad enough, but nothing to the horror of dismounting among them, while the thought of lying down in one's blankets at night within their jealously held territory was too hideous a hazard to contemplate. And all day long, when not too busy roasting my seat in the saddle, the boys were spinning to each other yarns, conceived for the occasion of a mate awakened to find a rattler coiled upon his breast, another bitten from beneath the ambush of a shrub when bending to picket his horse, of yet another slipping into a cave alive with them, each dying, of course, in tortures painted as fearsomely as they knew. Indeed, the active actual peril from the rattlers was at noon emphasized. When, our dinner finished, Nigger Dick, the horse wrangler, brought in the loose horses to the wagon. Someone noted him sucking his thumb and asked him what was the matter. "Done got stung by Brer Rattler. Seed a little young cottontail and allowed I'd sort of catch him. But hit done run me over the prickly pears and round the greasewood patches twell my old tongue was hanging out, and then hit up and dove into a hole just as I was gonna step on it. Yessah, I was sure close stop a Brer Rabbit, so close I runs my fool nigger arms into the hole, 'spectin' to get hit's hind paws. But 'stead o' that, Brer Rattler was lying thar, just rise up from his noon, there poundin' and powerful mad at Brer Rabbit for kicking him in de head. He just nails me good on de faux paw, and when I jerks away, out path way he comes, till one of his tooths slips out, and the other one, she just broke off and stay sticking in Dick's thumb. But I sure dug him out and broke him aft, for I quit, and all the time I lows Brer Rabbit was sitting deeper down the hole, a-laughing at Dick. Hell, but it do hurt. and indeed his hand and arm were already badly swollen. Promptly one of the boys drew the bullet from a pistol cartridge, took a knife and deeply gashed, almost hashed, the thumb all about the 2 tiny punctures, then poured the powder over the wound and fired it with a match. A crude method of cauterizing. It certainly seemed effective. Anyway, whether due to Dick sucking his thumb or to the rude cowboy surgery, the inflammation went no further, and Dick made a quick recovery. That night it took more nerve to lie down in my blankets in Rattlerland than I had needed the day before to face Miss Blanco. But as a matter of fact, as I later learned, so much later, it did me no good on this trip. Rattlers are never night prowlers on the plains, and hole up so soon as the chill of night comes on. And indeed, now, after years on the range, Dick remains the only man I ever personally knew bitten by a rattler. On this rodeo, we were out about a month, rounding up first the Crow Creek and Pawnee Butte country, then swinging up the South Platte River to Fremont's Orchard, thence to the sink of Willow Creek, and up Willow toward the home ranch. The first 48 hours I developed an appetite and a capacity to sleep never known before. In a week, I was fairly hardened to 16 to 18 hours a day in the saddle, most of the time on the jump. In a fortnight, I had accomplished a modest but certain entry into the mysteries of brands, earmarks, dewlaps, wattles, etc. At the end of 3 weeks, I could pitch and swing a riata tolerably, and notwithstanding sundry more or less hard falls incident to unwary steps in prairie dog holes, running over calves, cowboys' tricks, etc., had acquired a 4-year-old full-grown faith in my saddle seat. And it was precisely for this latter I had been waiting and working hardest. For the boys, joshing, never ceased. I was too good a thing to miss. The favorite subject of their jests and tricks was my early awkwardness and insecurity in the saddle, a fact they easily proved by the simple experiment of sticking a prickly pear pub beneath my horse's tail after I had mounted. While, of course, the trick was always played behind my back, I was never long in discovering it. Instantly, the horse began bucking furiously to lose the pear, and always finished by losing me first. As a pear buster, I was a dismal failure, but as a side splitter for the boys, I was a howling success. But all the time I was learning more of the knee and lower leg grip, the balance and swing needed to keep rider and bucker from parting company, till presently one day, early the 4th week, I resolved to make a play that, win or lose, could not fail to largely stop the galling chaff I was getting so tired of. An outlaw is a horse fuller of years than honors, spoiled by needless cruelty and the early breaking, spoiled so completely that he is bad to the end of his days, either as bucker, kicker, striker, biter, backfaller, etc., and usually master of all these accomplishments, a fighter in one or all of these ways every time he is saddled. Walking Bars was freely conceded to be the worst outlaw in the ND outfit, a great yellow-eyed, Roman-nosed, ewe-necked, long-barreled, heavy-quartered buckskin, every trick of the evil equine. Walking Bars knew, and he had the power to do these tricks longer and harder than any horse I have ever seen since. When Walking Bars got down to earnest pitching, it seemed, and usually proved, as hard to stop him as to stay the mighty swing of a side-wheeler's walking beam, and hence, I dare say, his name. Walking Bars was in the mount of a wiry little Mexican, Jose, who managed to handle him, but was tired of the task, and constantly cursing him. I decided to add Walking Bars to my mount. He might and probably would do a lot of things to me, but nothing I dreaded more than tenderfoot, and the chaff and tricks that went with the name, and it was to shake these annoyances at one stroke that, one morning on the circle, I proposed to trade Jose, my top horse, Goldie, for Walking Bars. Madre de Dios, muchacho, he kill you sure, but if you wish, you him have. y que Dios te aguarda." So the trade was settled, Jose promising to say nothing of it to the boys. When, therefore, at the noon camp, the horses were run into the rope pen, made of lariats outstretched from the chuck wagon wheels, and I pitched my rope over Walking Bar's head and dragged him out of the bunch, there was a profound sensation. "Now, Tender," called Lanolu, "you sure raised a hell poppin'. You stringin' old bars. How the hell ye reckon you're gonna get loose, 'fore he catches and swallows you? Then how the hell we uns goin' to get you pesky little pussin' out of him?" And all the time old Bars was surging on the rope and dragging me about, snorting, rearing, and striking. Just then I myself would have been glad to know of some way to get loose with some shred of dignity, but the play was made and had to be finished. It took a lot of time and patience and nearly wore me out, but finally I worked up the rope hand over hand until, dodging his strikes, I succeeded in slipping a half-inch over his nose, and then there was another long tussle before I could approach him. When at length I again got in arm's reach, I began gingerly to rub his nose, scratch his head, and pat his neck, and, wonder of wonders, he actually stood still, apparently in sheer astonishment to meet a puncher that neither yelled at, struck, nor jerked him. Presently I got a lump of sugar in his mouth, and then a second. It tasted good, and the wicked eyes glared less balefully, the nervous ears drooped lazily, the resentful muscles relaxed, and old Bars stood quietly at ease. Then I softly slipped my bridle from the back of my belt, slowly approached it to his head, gently, very gently, pressed the tongue of the bit into the side of his mouth, and he received it, along with another lump of sugar. And a moment later, I had the headstall over his ears. Walking Bars stood bridled, a trick never accomplished by Jose himself, in the rough way he went at it, until after a hard 10 to 15 minutes fight. And the explanation was easy. Old Bars was simply stunned with wonder to find a puncher who didn't try to jam his teeth down his throat with the cruel bit steel. Why shouldn't he let such have his will? Then came the saddle, and it took a lot of diplomacy and time to place and cinch it, for old Bars was handy with whirling kicks, one of which would cave one's chest in. Once during the saddling, he came out of his trances and fought me, but with patience and more patting and another lump of sugar, he was again quieted till the saddling was finished, and I had him safely tied to a wagon wheel. Approval was frank and profanely emphatic. "Wow, I'll be good." "Too," remarked Jack Talbot, "if that don't beat the Comanches. The kid sure must have powerful Injun medicine. 'Tis too strong for old Bars. I'd have never believed that was ary puncher between the Gulf and Kennedy could bridle and saddle old Bars that away, without fighting him all over a 5-acre lot, and we be calling of you Tendy. If you was willing to shake with me, Mr. Kid, I would consider it a honor." And we shook, for you surely had a medicine bag for outlaws hid out about your person that made Jeff Jerry or the Pineaus look like plow pushers. But for the love of home and mammy, you don't allow to climb that old yaller hell twister, does you? His neck's too long for you to get it. Whipper his ear, like you been doing, and if he forgets. The purty as you been promising him, you can bet your ass no roll, no stirrup trying, or leather grabbing, I'll keep you from getting throwed so far it would take you a week to walk back to camp if he has any sound bones left to walk on. And when a half hour later I let out old Bars, after first secretly slipping him yet another bit of sugar, while the boys sat their horses at a little distance, coiled my rope, and held the loose coils in my left hand, seized reins and headstall with the left, and gently bent old Bars' head toward me, and then caught stirrup, grabbed saddle horn, and swung slowly into the saddle, and quietly fastened my rope with a horn string, A wild yell of approval rose from the boys. That was near being my undoing. Till it came, walking bars had stood perfectly quiet, but a cowboy yell was old bars, tossin' of war, and for a time it broke the spell of my medicine, and came near smashing me. He lit into such bucking as I had never dreamed I could stand a second. But hooking spurs and cinch, and pulling leather ignominiously, I contrived to stay on him for perhaps a dozen jumps, when lo, a miracle. Suddenly he stopped, stock still, bent his neck, and gazed back in my face with a "That's a sugar cup, and I better not break it" look in his eyes. And when I lightly shook the reins, he quietly trotted up to the waiting group of boys. As I joined them, I heard Tex remark, "Lou, does you allow it's loco or sense and sand the kid's sufferin' most from?" After the conquest, for the time being at least, complete of walking bars, the worst outlaw bronco in the ND brand, I felt the crisis of my trials as a tenderfoot was past. But this proved erroneous widely. Most of the punchers hailed my success with walking bars with satisfaction, and showed me a cordiality that made me feel that I had at least one foot drawn out of the slough of tenderfootdom. But one man seemed actually to resent my good fortune, the evil-tempered foreman, Con Humphreys. He may not have wanted me killed outright, but he certainly did seem to want to see me more or less maimed or disfigured. Indeed, the only thing that made at all endurable his general mental attitude toward the outfit at large, and each puncher in particular, was the fact that he seemed to hate himself quite as cordially as he did the rest of us. His was a mirthless life, devoid even of any sense of pleasure, except when engaged in inflicting some needless cruelty he judged could not be resented. Already Humphreys had been stacking me up against the toughest and some of the riskiest tasks of roundup work, tasks to try the skill and nerve of the oldest rawhide of them all, and when, as often happened, I acquitted myself none too well, he sneered at and abused me all he dared with a protege of his boss, N.R. The very morning after I first saddled and rode walking bars, and it had begun to dawn upon his shrewd equine brain that it paid well to curb his savage temper and permit mastery to a puncher who handled him gently and spoke to him kindly. Con's malignant disposition cropped out anew. When out an hour from the lower Willow Corral, the herd in hand strung out a mile or more along the winding trail upstream, a many-tinted ribbon of bright color moving ever forward across the endless rolling sea of pale yellow buffalo grass, seen upon the hillocks and disappearing in the swales. The little Mexican Jose rode back into the dense dust clouds at the rear of the herd, where, with two others, I was shouting and pounding along with drags, the lame, the lazy, the footsore, and the young, all together like rottenest task about a moving herd, and asked, "Need you see old Bars this morning?" "No," I answered. "You go, Ramunda. Look at him. I takes your place few minutes. Latigando esto duablos de muertos." So I loped over to the Ramunda, a few hundred yards away, where the horse wrangler was slowly drifting and grazing his charges. As usual, old Bars was well out on the flank of the bunch, flocking by his lonesome, and it needed only a glance to note that his jacamo had been removed. The jacamo is a stout headstall made of horsehair, then always used in bronco breaking and handling, either instead of or in connection with a bridle. With only a riata loop about a bronco's neck, he could drag one about corral or over prairie for half an hour before you could pretend to try to place a saddle. But with the end of a riata fastened to the loop of a Giacomo's noseband, every pull meant stronger smothering pressure over his nostrils, and he soon ceased steady heavy pull on the rope. Usually after a few days' handling, the Giacomo was no longer necessary with the average bronco, but with old bars it could never be dispensed with. Without one on his head, it was utterly impossible to bridle and saddle him, and to put a Giacomo on him needed that he be roped by the forelegs and thrown, and hog-tied, his 4 feet bunched and lashed fast together with half hitches, helpless, a job evidently yet far beyond me. Who could have played me the foul trick of removing bars headstall I could not fancy, unless Con himself. I hurried back to the drags and questioned Jose. He answered, "Inmediatamente baffo. We leave the camp. I see eso Diablo Con. Cut him off. If I you, I shoot hell at him pronto and go on scout. You say, see? I help you, me." Jose meant it, every word, for he, next to me, had been most frequently a victim of Con's meanness. But I merely thanked him, asked him to keep my place with the drags till my return, and trotted forward where Tex rode in the lead swing a couple of 100 yards behind Con's position on the left point of the herd. Good old Tex heard my story and my statement that I saw nothing for it but to call Con down or turn in my string of horses and quit the outfit, and then softly drawled, "Kid, it is sure up to you. You go on the prod. Horn him with the meanest cuss word you knows, especially about his closest kinfolk. Tell him if he munkers with you, you string again. You'll hang his scalp on your lodgepole. If he bats an eye or makes an airy move for his gun, get him. Do it powerful quick. Course, you can't shoot none sudden like him, so you just stays close to him. If you was sitting up with your best gal, and the first move he makes you jerks your gun and bends her good and plenty over, that misshaped coconut he was in place of a head, then you bend her back straight with another lick. I'll sort of drift along after you, thin, easy gun range. Then, if he gets you, kid, it'll be the last gun game he'll get to ante in, and then it'll be Tex for the count. But we'll make her a square play. I won't chip in, for you're down." This cheering proposal was inspired in part, no doubt, by a growing friendship for me, but largely by a profound dislike for the foreman. I rode forward to Con. Hearing my approach, he looked back with an ugly scowl and called, "What in hell you doing here, you ornery kid? Didn't I leave you along of the drags and doggies you belong with?" "Yes, Humphreys, you did," I replied, "and I'm ready to try to do my best at whatever job you put me on. But I'm up here now to tell you you've got to quit your abuse, quit your tricks with my string of horses, and limit your dealings with me to plain orders in the regular line of work." For a minute or two he was silent with astonishment. Then he burst out, "What in damnation you kicking about now, you—" "Cut out the description or settle here, Con," I interrupted. "I specially refer to your cutting the Giacomo off bars this morning." "Huh? Did you see it done?" "No, but others did," I answered. "Wall," he snarled, "whoever says I done it is a liar." "You'll not tell Jose that," I suggested. He straightened in the saddle, shortened rein, tightened knee grip, and truculently growled, "Well, suppose I did. What in hell you gonna do about it? Blat to old N.R., I reckon?" "No, Con, nothing of the sort. You're going to order the men to throw bars at the noon camp and put on him a new Giacomo, and you're going to settle with me for any new outrage you try to play. It'll be just the two of us." And I lightly touched my spur to my pony's side and moved him up till my right knee was nearly touching his left. within the easy reach of his coconut, as Tex had advised. For a full 2 minutes, I should think, we sat gazing into each other's eyes, every muscle tense and sense alert. He studying whether to venture upon offense, I intent to draw and strike before he could draw and shoot. The position was perfect for my plan, for his head was defenseless against a blow, except by releasing his bridle rein, leaving his horse momentarily unmanageable, or by spurring away from me, and against the latter move, I was hedging my readiness to plunge my spurs into my horse's flank. A face fuller of malice and murder I never confronted. A big-eared and peaked like a wolf's, but shifty-eyed and currish as a coyote. A face conveying no fear of a frontal attack, but promising large hazard of ambush. The face of an assassin, but not of a fighter. Still, the provocation from his standpoint was great, and had wrought in him a rage nigh impossible to curb. Presently, the nearby neigh of a horse behind him caused him to quickly turn his head, to see old Tex idly sitting his horse 75 yards away, his .44 Winchester plainly loosened and partly drawn from the scabbard, his right hand caressing the stock, apparently watching the moving herd, but at an angle that left us well within the tail of his eye. Instantly he realized Tex had either scented trouble or had been told of it, and was there to pot him on the slightest excuse. Then the hard lines of his face relaxed, and, with a surly grin, he spoke. "Why, kid, 'pears to me you're powerful head up over nothing. 'Cause you taking off Bar's sombrero was part just a joke, and part to see if you couldn't put her back on again, with one of them big medicine plays you worked on, with Bar's yesterday. I 'lowed you'd admire a chance to put it all over on the boys, by nonchalantly talking old Bars into begging the privilege of wearing a new bunnet. Of course, if you 'lows your medicine ain't that strong, we'll throw the old and slap her on for you. As for roughing on you, why, hell, if you had half the sense you appear to packin' the little nut of yourn, you'd see I've been trying con's best to give you a show for the biggest punch, honest, and make you a top-hand pronto. But it do sure look like you don't appreciate it, leaving the drinks on con and the chamberin' of them on you. Bet your ass from now on you can larn by your lonesome, fur as I'm concerned." And he rode forward, where at his neglected point the herd was spreading out like a fan, contentedly grazing. I turned back toward the drags, and Tex rode with me halfway down the long line of the herd. "Always knew he was a coyote," commented Tex. "Throws too many John Branch Ranakaboo bluffs of his own to call anyone else's. He'll just rar up his hind legs and come at you with his mouth open, like he were the whale, and you Jonah. In the first flutter you gives, he shuts his face hard, though, and busts his nutcrackers, and drops on all fours, and scoots for the nearest bunch of brush. To hell with such animals anyway. They sure do make my back tired." Thus relieved, Tex reined west and rode to his place in the swing. When at the noon camp the horses were run into the ropes for catching the afternoon mounts, Con called, "Tex, drop your twine on Bars and Lano and Jack. You all help him throw and tie Bars and get his head into my Giacomo." Tex pitched his rope over Bar's head, snubbed the end of the rope about his own hips, and as Bars bounded out of the ropes, braced feet forward and body back for the tug. Notwithstanding the severe choking of the riata noose about his neck, with all Tex's weight and strength straining at the other end of the rope, mad old Bars dragged his captor about the prairie at almost racing speed, a good 10 minutes before Lano could get within casting reach to noose his forefeet. Then, with a sharp pull to the left by Tex and to the right by Lano, Down smash on his side fell the equine warrior, and before he could gather, Tex had a knee on his neck, a hand smothering his nostrils, and his muzzle turned skyward, while Lano had thrown a quick half-hitch over his left hind foot and drawn it up tightly against the noose that bound the forefeet. Still, this left his good right leg free, and it swung with a ferocity and rapidity that looked like he had a score of hooves free instead of one. Indeed, his tawny length was darkened by an aureola of flying black hooves hovering above him. One stroke gave Bars joy. It caught Tex in the armpit and sent him sprawling, freeing the wicked old Roman nosed head and bringing new lust and hope of liberty into the blazing eyes. But rise he could not, with 3 feet tightly bound, and soon Talbot lit on his neck and again got his muzzle upturned. All the time Lano had been throwing half-hitches of his rope at the flying hoof. Presently, one of Lano's throws landed, and a moment later Bars lay helpless, hog-tied, his 4 feet securely lashed together. Then the fastening the Giacomo on his head was an easy task, so the vicious teeth were avoided. Released, old Bars shook himself, glared resentfully at his enemies, and trotted back into the Ramunda. Coiling his rope, Lano remarked, "I sure never see that much pizen in hell wrapped up a airy hoss hide before. Bars snaps like a gator, springs like a painter, and strikes and kicks like his legs was driving by a little old steam engine inside him. His eyes, wow, damn his eyes. I'd rather look in the talking end of a gun than have old Bars draw his eyes on me when he hits the warpath. Just looks like he'd follow you from Corpus to Cheyenne to get you. Though sleeping or grazing on the way, just nonchalantly eat you up wherever he's catched you. Damn his old gory eyes anyway. They sure do talk more war than I can use. Kid, you was certainly welcome to that old yaller hellion, and if I was you, I'd lope back to Pawnee Butte, climber, and Sundance there for a week trying to fill my medicine bag with new tricks for I tackled Bars again. Then I'd just jump off that east cliff rather than tackle him, to give him time to cool off from the indignities put upon him. I waited a couple of days before venturing any new liberties with walking Bars. To the infinite surprise of the outfit, he proved still fairly amenable to kindness, and so he remained to the end of our association, bar an occasional exhibition of violence to leave it plain his comparative tractability was due to sufferance rather than to surrender. A few days later, when we were approaching the Owl Creek Ranch, and Con realized it was nearing his last chance to get even, he took a final fall out of me, and it was a good one. One morning at breakfast, he called across the campfire, "Kid, the old man told me he wanted a good fresh milk cow, soon as I could get her to him. We're a week late now getting back, and I reckon he's powerful hot, 'cause he ain't got her before. Yesterday, I threw out into the cut a shore dandy, 3/4 short horn, and her calf. 'Tis just about what in our wants. When you saddle up, I'll cut the pair out to you. You can run 'em in the home ranch. 'Tis only 20 miles, and if you're right pert, you can run 'em in there again noon and get back to camp tonight. Can't he, boys?" With a significant glance around the circle of punchers squatted at their breakfast. I noted them look at each other in surprise, but for a long time none spoke. Presently, however, Lano blurted out, "By Con, I'll bet you my outfit, gun, saddle, and tricks again. You can't pick every cow in half. Out of the herd, you yourself, single-handed, can keep bunched by their lonesomes. Out in the thousands of loose range cattle that make this plain look crowded as a bee teepee, and keep anywhere near a course with 'em for 5 miles. Could be sure to break into some of those loose bunches or get on the prod and stand you off. Oh, the calf I'll play out, go into camp while his mammy runs you a foot races trying to loose you from a calf. Sides, there's no trail from here, Owl Creek Ranch. All you could do is put the kid in general direction and tell him to chase his nose and what in hell to keep up the bead, his tenderfoot nose in Old Owl Creek. He'd sure get lost so hard, it'd keep all the riders of the General South Platte Roundup a circling a week to get to throw him to the bunch. And by that time, he'd be a lean and loony, a sheep herder, and wild the old black stallion of Chalk Bluffs. Con scowled angrily at Lano, and then said, with a poor attempt at an agreeable smile, "Kid, that freckled shorthorn that miscalls himself from Lano is a short sport and a long shot from a real rawhide. He loves to buffalo you. They ain't airy sure enough rawhide in the bunch, as I'll say, it can't be did, and did easy." And he looked threateningly about the circle. "Oh, of course, it'll keep you humping yourself a few, but you'll see the end of the trail long 'fore night." And he must have added under his breath, "Any trail but the one to Owl Creek." "Lano, you speckled doggy, why in your fool soul, if we didn't have this bunch of cows under herd, I'd just call your hand and set you afoot. For I'd gamble all I got I could take my top-cutting horse and run every cow in half in the bunch into the Owl Creek pens without ranning or quirting." This settled the question for me. I knew the job was considered a deadly hard one by every man in camp, knew it by their very silence, proving it one of the few subjects too serious to talk and jest about, but jumped at it gladly as another opportunity in the struggle to lose my identity as a tenderfoot. While I was saddling my toughest horse outside of walking bars, whom I did not dare trust on such a trip, Tex strolled over for a friendly word. "Kid, Con stacked you up again. It good and plenty this time. The range is black with the LF and ND cows every jump of the way. If you get to pen that cow in half at Owl Creek, one of old master's red-headedest miracles, side which a feller a-walking on water or a-climbing out the belly of a big fish. So easy at taking your morning coffee. But you can make a hell of a stagger at it and do your the best, and you might draw luck enough to get there. If you do, they're on airy puncher between Goliad and Greeley, but I'd admire to throw in with you as an expert rawhide, and to pump lead at any critter that says you ain't straight off the hate. Waits Old Bitter Creek. The main trick, kid, is to keep her off the prod and sweet-tempered. If your crowds are too hard and gets her on the fight, it's Katie bar the door with you, and adios to her and her calf. Put in most of your time at shoving those loose range stock back away from you, and keep her drifting toward Owl Creek, so easy like she knows she's going, 'cause she just nonchalantly has important business up there she's bound to tend to herself. 2 miles up Willow, the upper pen, you strikes off northwest. Our wagon sign coming down, it'll be all washed out by the rains, but if you can keep a northwest course for 15 miles, you'll hit the west end of the Chalk Bluffs, with a lone butte a standing, out by herself, and you goes up over the pass between the butte and the main bluffs, and in the top of the pass you can see the ranch 3 miles away. If you gets to the east or north, it'll take you to the deep bays or the bluffs, where the country's all standing on an edge, and you'll stand on your head. If you bear too far west, it'll be lay out under your saddle blanket, so you can save the case where you brings up. It's 40 mile north to the UP, same west to the DP 50 south to the Platte, same east to Crow Creek, with only one other ranch in the square. Brewster's, so you ain't liable to be crowded none, except to know straight up from sideways. If you gets plumb lost, just get down on the saddle and rest and graze your horse and study it over plenty. Then pick a course somewhere, anywheres, fork your cayuse and keep going plumb straight till you runs up against something sides, just room to ride in, or meets up with somebody that at itself and can get down and make a map in the sand and show you where you're at. And this was all Tex or indeed anybody could do for me. I mounted and rode out to the herd already stringing out on the trail. While Con was riding up the line searching for the cow and calf he had selected, Jack Talbot rode up and observed, "Mr. Kid, I sure gets from under my hat to you, Gall. Old N.R. and his'n couldn't live on owl milk till the whole damn family hooted every blamed time they tried to say something. For I'd try to run 'em alone and half-cow from Willow T to the home ranch. You has my respect for lightning to do it. And if you gets her there, I'll make that old ornery Con Humphreys kill the biggest maverick in the bunch and write you on the inside of its hide with wagon dope for ink and his pointed old nose for a pen. A full diploma for being the ring-tailest puncher between the Brazos and Bow River. Shows my daddy's name's Talbot." By the time Jack had finished his friendly remarks, Con had found the cow, cut her from the herd, and yelled to me to come and take her, which I did. She was a half-bred Durham, with the breadth and depth of a quarter of the better breed, but the long, sharp horns of her Spanish ancestry, wild, like the rest, as a deer, and was followed by a calf 2 or 3 weeks old. Keen to break back to the herd, she gave me a lively run to carry her past and beyond the point of the herd, but once ahead, I had comparatively easy going for 2 miles up Willow Valley and 2 miles more out northwest from the upper pen, for the sun was scarcely a half-hour high, and the range cattle were still well out in the hills feeding. I crowded her little as possible, both to avoid getting her on the fight and to save the calf's strength, for once the calf played out or the mother got out on the prod, driving must cease. All about me lay the billowy plains, rising gently into tall, rounded yellow ridges, one like another as 2 peas, and then sinking into valleys, rising and sinking, ever rising and sinking. Indeed, the landscape, look where one would, was devoid of helpful landmark or any description save the dark blue line nearly 100 miles west of me that marked the great wall of the Rockies, with Pike's Peak as farthest visible buttress to the south, breaking down to more modest height north of Gray's Peak and stretching away into the north till lost entirely to view behind distant swells of the plains. And even the Rockies helped me none in keeping my course, for north of Gray's Peak the visible reach of the range was, at my distance, without distinguishing uplift to help me steer by. About 4 miles out from camp and 2 north of the upper Willow Corrals, my real troubles began, and they were real enough. The plains were alive, swarming everywhere with cattle, grazing singly and in groups, and the cow, which I was not long in dubbing Con's Revenge, broke at top speed in and all directions that ranged widest from our proper route. She would dash off at top speed, a pace the calf could not follow, and that quickly distanced it, and it took near the best gait of my horse to head up and turn her back, often to find the calf clumsily galloping toward another, by this time, nearer bunch. Then the two had to be thrown together and turned away from the group the calf was nearing. By the time we were out about 8 miles, as near as I could judge from the pen, Con's Revenge had gotten tired down, till her brakes were at the trot instead of a gallop. My horse was showing some distress, and Mrs. Revenge made 2 breaks to charge and chase me when I sought to turn her back. So, seeing there was nothing for it but patience and time, I swept out in a wide circle ahead, yelling and shooting and scattering the range stock to right and left, and then wheeled back, only to see Mrs. Revenge trotting away toward Willow fast as the calf could follow, requiring another half-mile dash to overtake and turn her. And this wearing, heartbreaking work continued for hours, with occasional brief dismounts to loosen my saddle and cool and rest my horse when range cattle were at a safe distance, usually after one of my short runs to scatter them. I had hoped to sight the point of Chalk Bluffs before noon, but the day dragged on into mid-afternoon with naught but the swells and dips of the plains. and the distant blue line of the Rockies in sight. The keeping a course had been made all the more difficult by my constant dashes to right and left, stampeding away the range cattle, and by this time I hadn't the ghost of an idea of my real position, except that I had felt sure I must have passed the bluff point too far south to see it. All certain was that I still had my charges safely in hand, now so leg-weary they were glad to rest when I had to leave them to clear the way. The cow, so ill-tempered she often charged or stood and threatened me for 5 or 10 minutes, eyes blazing, horns tossing. With night approaching, a storm coming rapidly down on me from the northeast, and my horse close to dead on his legs, I decided to take a chance on my judgment and swung my course as well as I could to the east of north. And lucky I was to make the shift, for in half an hour a great butte rose out of the plains, a trifle to the right of my course. It did not look like the point of Chalk Bluffs to me, but it was something to cling to, and I made for it. An hour later, in the very nick of time before a heavy plunging rain came down and shut out any distant view off in the north, to the left of the butte, I saw a big ranch and corrals, which must be in ours. In the storm, cow and calf became utterly unmanageable, and 2 miles south of the ranch, I left them and rode in to make sure of cover before I lost my direction in the storm. As I neared the ranch, the downpour ceased, and the sun came out, showing me good old N.R. himself, comfortably settled in an easy chair on the porch. "Well, kid, where's the roundup?" was his greeting. "Camp tonight at the Upper Willow Pen," I replied. "Well, what are you doing away from it? Come a little too tough and turned in your string of horses and quit?" he asked. "No, Con started me at sunup this morning to drive you in a milk cow and calf," I answered. "Started you alone to drive a wild cow and calf 20 miles through range cattle?" He did. Wonder if he was mad or crazy. "Well, where is she anyhow?" he snapped. 2 miles south of the ranch. I left her in the storm and came in," I said. "Oh, you did? Well, your orders were to bring her here, were they not?" "Yes." "Well, I guess you better get her." "Give me a fresh horse and I will. Mine's dead on its legs. Should think he'd be dead all over. You can rope any you like out of the pen." A few minutes later, I loped away south on a fresh mount. Had the luck to find my charges somewhat cooled off by the storm and rested, and drifting them on slowly and gently, succeeded in safely penning them just at sunset. They were so worn and tired, they marched up to and through the corral gate like a bunch of wild horses after a 9-day walk down. As I was unsaddling, N.R. strolled up and observed, "Kid, you've sure won puncher spurs today." And that night I dined luxuriously at the big ranch house table.